The morning mist clung to Clearview Lake like something that didn't want to let go. I stood on the dock Caroline and I had built together 23 years ago, watching the sun burn through the gray and turn the water into hammered silver. My coffee had gone cold in the mug, the blue ceramic one with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the imperfection the same way she did with everything broken that still had purpose left in it. The lake house stretched behind me, every board and beam a memory. We'd found this place when Ethan was just 7, a rundown cabin with good bones and a view that made Caroline stop talking mid-sentence. "This is where we'll grow old," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled me from the water's edge. Too early for visitors. Too deliberate for someone who'd made a wrong turn. I walked around the side of the house and felt my chest tighten. A black SUV sat in my driveway like it owned the place. The driver's door opened, and out stepped my son. Ethan looked prosperous. That was the word Caroline would have used. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly pressed, the kind that costs more than most people spend on clothes in a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, touched with silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than older. He moved with the confident stride of a man who expected doors to open for him. 3 more doors opened. Madison emerged from the passenger side, my daughter-in-law. Though she'd never seemed comfortable with that title, she wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair swept back in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve. From the back seat came 2 older figures I recognized from wedding photos, Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. The 4 of them stood in my driveway like a delegation. Gerald adjusted his sport coat and surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched her purse and whispered something to Madison that made my daughter-in-law nod with satisfaction. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days. Better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright and practiced. "You're looking good." "Ethan." I stepped back to let them pass. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." Gerald's handshake was firm, aggressive. Patricia offered her cheek for a kiss I didn't give. Madison smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with perfume and aftershave, and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. "Coffee?" I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host even when I didn't feel like one. "This won't take long," Ethan said, which should have been my first warning. We gathered in the living room, them on the sofa Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. Gerald's eyes roamed the room, taking inventory. He lingered on the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom entertainment center, the hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Caroline's vision," I said. "She had ideas about everything, down to which trees to plant so they'd frame the view just right." Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," Ethan said. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, the posture of a man delivering important news. "The future of this place." I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. "Madison's parents need a place to live," Ethan continued. "Their lease is up next month, and with Gerald's retirement—" He gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely as if confirming a tragedy. "We've been looking at senior communities," Gerald said, "but the good ones have waiting lists. And the costs—" He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Their family," Madison added, her voice soft but insistent. "And this house has so much space, more than you need, really." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them waiting for my response, watching my face for signs of weakness or compliance. But I'd spent 40 years managing construction crews, negotiating with contractors, staring down building inspectors who thought they could intimidate an old man with a clipboard. My expression didn't change. "I see," I said finally. "We thought," Ethan said, speaking faster now, "maybe it would be good for you too. All this space, all these memories. It might be time to downsize, move somewhere more manageable." "Somewhere more manageable," I repeated. "There's a nice senior community in Millbrook," Patricia offered brightly. "Garden apartments, meal service, activities. You'd have people your own age to socialize with." I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who'd learned to fish from this dock, who had helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the old oak, who'd brought Caroline wildflowers from the meadow every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. "And if I don't want to move?" I asked. The question caught them off guard. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances. Madison's smile faltered. Ethan's jaw tightened in a way I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. "Dad," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a child. "Be reasonable. You're 70 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if you fall? What if something happens? What if it does?" "We worry about you," Madison said, though she'd never shown any evidence of worry before. "Living out here alone, with your heart condition, my heart condition is managed." "Still," Ethan said, "wouldn't it be nice to have people around? To not have to worry about maintenance, yard work, all the things that get harder as we age?" I stood and walked to the window that faced the lake. The morning mist was burning off, revealing the water in all its October glory. Caroline's garden was still blooming. The late roses she'd babied through 15 summers, the Japanese maples she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year, the dock where we'd sat countless evenings, watching the sun set behind the pines. "This house isn't just a house," I said without turning around. "It's Caroline's legacy. It's where we built our life together." "She's gone, Dad." Ethan's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. "She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back." I turned to face them. 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by sacrificing my own. "The house stays with me," I said quietly. Gerald leaned forward. "Richard, let's be practical about this. The upkeep alone must be—" "The house stays with me," I repeated. "Dad." Ethan stood, running a hand through his silver hair. "We're trying to help you. Can't you see that?" "Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for? Everything Caroline and I built together?" "Move on," Madison said sharply. "That's what normal people do. They move on." The room went silent. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable with the naked honesty of it. But Madison had said what they were all thinking, that my grief was inconvenient, my attachment to this place unreasonable, my refusal to accommodate their plans selfish. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note echoing through rooms that suddenly felt too small to contain what was happening. I thought of Caroline, of the way she'd stand her ground when something mattered. She wouldn't have let them get this far. "I appreciate your concern," I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. "But this is my home. It will remain my home until I decide otherwise." Ethan's face flushed. "And what about family? What about helping people when they need it?" "You mean helping the family that visits twice a year? The family that calls on holidays if they remember? That's not fair, isn't it?" I looked at each of them in turn. "When did you last ask how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, but how I was managing?" No one answered. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "I thought so," I said. They left without ceremony, filing out to their SUV with the stiff posture of people who'd been denied something they'd considered already theirs. I watched from the window as they drove away, gravel spitting from their tires. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. I picked up Caroline's photograph from the mantel, the one taken here at the lake on our 40th anniversary. She was laughing at something I'd said, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that doesn't fade even in still images. "They wanted to take this away from us," I whispered to her smile. Outside, the lake reflected the afternoon sky like polished steel. A loon called from somewhere across the water, its voice wild and lonely. I'd heard that sound every summer for 23 years, but today it sounded different. Today it sounded like a warning. Comment yes. If you want to see more similar stories. The phone rang at 7:30 that evening, just as I was heating leftover soup on the stove. The caller ID showed Ethan's number, but I let it ring. 4 times, 5, then silence. A minute later, it rang again. This time I answered. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice was different now, sharper, with the practiced patience stripped away. "We talked this morning." "No, we made a presentation this morning. You didn't listen." I turned off the burner and leaned against the counter. Through the kitchen window, I could see the lights of other houses across the lake, families settling in for the evening. Normal families who probably didn't spend their dinners plotting against each other. "I listened fine," I said. "I just didn't like what I heard." "Dad, you're being unreasonable. Madison's parents need this place more than you do. Gerald lost his job 6 months ago. Did you know that? Patricia's on disability. They've got nowhere to go. Then maybe they should have planned better." "Jesus, Dad! When did you become so cold?" The question hit harder than I expected. When had I become cold? Maybe it was 3 years ago, standing beside Caroline's grave while dirt fell onto her coffin. Maybe it was last Christmas, eating dinner alone while my son sent a text instead of calling. Or maybe it was this morning, watching 4 people discuss my life like I wasn't in the room. "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm tired of being taken for granted." "No one's taking you for granted. We're trying to help you by taking my house, by giving you a chance to do something meaningful with your life instead of sitting in that place talking to ghosts." The words hung between us like a slap. I could hear him breathing, probably realizing he'd gone too far. But damage, once done, doesn't undo itself with regret. "Your mother isn't a ghost," I said quietly. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." I hung up the phone and stood there listening to the dial tone until it became unbearable. The soup had gone cold. I poured it down the drain and made myself a sandwich instead, ham and cheese on the bread Caroline used to buy. Cut diagonal the way she'd taught me, because it tastes better that way. Sitting at the kitchen table, I could feel the weight of the empty house pressing down. Every room held conversations we'd never have again. Laughter that had been used up, plans that had died with her. But Ethan was wrong about the ghosts. Caroline wasn't haunting this place. She was living in it, in the wallpaper she'd chosen for the guest bathroom, in the way the morning light hit the kitchen counter just right, in the garden that still bloomed because I tended it the way she'd shown me. Taking me away from here wouldn't free me from grief. It would erase the only place where she was still real. I pulled out the photo albums Caroline had organized with military precision, each picture labeled with her careful handwriting. Here was Ethan at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, as he held up a fish he'd caught off our dock. At 10, serious and focused as I taught him to use a level on the deck we were building. At 16, rolling his eyes as Caroline insisted on taking his picture before prom. When had that boy become this man? I traced the progression through the photos, looking for the moment when love had been replaced by calculation. There, maybe it was in the wedding pictures. Ethan looked happy, but there was something in Madison's eyes, a kind of measuring that made me uncomfortable even then. Caroline had noticed it too. "She looks at things like she's adding up their value," she'd whispered during the reception. "I hope that's not how she looks at our boy." But I'd brushed off her concern. Madison came from money. Old money, the kind that spoke in polite whispers and knew which fork to use for what. I'd thought she might be good for Ethan, might settle him down, give him the stability he'd always seemed to lack. Instead, she'd given him ambition of the wrong kind. Not the ambition to build something lasting, but the ambition to acquire, to possess, to see everything through the lens of ownership and control. Gerald and Patricia had raised a daughter who viewed relationships as transactions, and she'd taught my son to see me the same way. The phone rang again at 9 o'clock. This time, I didn't even look at the caller ID. "Dad, please don't hang up." It was Madison's voice, honey-sweet and carefully modulated. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. Ethan gets emotional sometimes. He doesn't always express himself clearly. What we're proposing is really more of a partnership. You'd still have your space in the house, your own room, your privacy, and you'd have family around, people who care about you. My own room, I repeated. In my own house. Well, yes, but think about it. Wouldn't it be nice to have help with the cooking, the cleaning, the yard work? Dad's very handy, and Mom loves to cook. We could all take care of each other. I could picture her as she spoke, probably pacing around that sterile apartment they rented in town, gesturing with manicured hands while she tried to sell me on my own displacement. The worst part was how reasonable she made it sound, how she'd wrapped their greed in the language of care and family obligation. Madison, I said, let me ask you something. In this partnership of yours, who would hold the deed to the house? Silence. Then, well, Dad would handle the legal aspects. He's very good with paperwork. Gerald would hold the deed. It's just a formality, Richard. For tax purposes, insurance, that sort of thing. I'd still be a tenant in my own home. That's not how we see it. But that's what it would be. More silence. I could hear voices in the background, Ethan and Gerald conferring, probably coaching her on what to say next. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced warmth. Richard, we're trying to be fair here, but you need to understand, this house is too much for you. What happens when you can't manage the stairs anymore? When you fall and there's no one to help? We're thinking about your safety. My safety, I said, not your convenience. Of course your safety. We love you. Do you? The question seemed to catch her off guard. Of course we do. Your family. Then why does this feel like I'm being evicted? That's not what this is. But her protest sounded hollow, even to her. I could hear it in her voice, the moment when she realized her script had run out and she was on her own. Tell me something, Madison, I said. If you love me so much, why haven't you visited since Caroline's funeral? Why don't you call except when you need something? Why does family only matter when it's convenient for you? We've been busy. Everyone's busy. That's not an excuse. I heard Gerald's voice in the background, sharp and impatient. Madison covered the phone, but I could still make out the words. Just tell him we'll make it worth his while. When she came back on the line, her tone had changed completely. The honey was gone, replaced by something harder. Richard, we're trying to do this the nice way, but you should know that Gerald has been looking into your finances, your medical records. There are questions about your capacity to manage such a large property, questions that could become official if necessary. The threat hung in the air like smoke. They weren't just asking me to leave. They were preparing to force me out. I thought about Gerald's calculating gaze as he'd surveyed my living room, the way he'd inventoried everything I owned. He hadn't been admiring my craftsmanship. He'd been appraising it. Are you threatening me, Madison? I'm trying to help you understand the reality of your situation. Let me help you understand mine, I said. This house was built by my hands, paid for with my sweat, filled with 43 years of marriage to a woman worth more than all of you combined. You want to take it from me? You want to make me a stranger in my own home? Then you better bring more than threats and pretty words. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from anger that had been building for 3 years and finally had somewhere to go. Outside, the lake was black glass under a starless sky. A nighthawk called from somewhere in the darkness, hunting prey that couldn't see it coming. I understood the feeling. For too long, I'd been the prey, isolated, vulnerable, an easy target for people who confused grief with weakness. But grief hadn't made me weak. It had made me careful, deliberate, patient. And patience was something I'd learned from 40 years of construction work, where rushing led to mistakes and mistakes led to collapse. I walked to Caroline's desk in the corner of the living room, the one where she'd paid bills and written letters and planned the garden layouts that still guided my planting each spring. I pulled out a legal pad and wrote options at the top in block letters, the way I used to start project plans. Under it, I made 2 columns: what they want and what I have. In the first column, I wrote house, land, removal of obstacle, me. In the second, legal ownership, community respect, knowledge of construction and contracts, time to plan, 2. Then I drew a third column, what they don't know. This column took longer to fill. They didn't know I'd been paying attention to their financial troubles, Gerald's job loss, their mounting debts, the way they'd moved twice in the past year to cheaper rentals. They didn't know I still had friends in the construction business, Men who knew how to research property records and building codes and the kind of legal maneuvers that could tie up ambitious people for years. Most importantly, they didn't know that 40 years of building things had taught me something else: how to tear them down. I looked at Caroline's photograph on the desk, her smile as bright and determined as it had been on our wedding day. "What do you think?" I asked her. "Time to stop being nice?" The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice. "Richard Dalton, you've been nice long enough." I closed the legal pad and put it away. Tomorrow I would start making phone calls, but tonight I would plan. Because the best revenge isn't loud or flashy or cruel. The best revenge is precise, legal, and completely unexpected. They wanted my house. They were about to learn why taking something from a man who knows how to build is a very dangerous game. The sleepless hours between midnight and dawn have their own particular weight. I'd forgotten that, how grief changes time, making minutes feel like hours while months disappear without notice. I sat in Caroline's chair by the window, wrapped in the quilt she'd made during her last winter, watching the lake hold the moon's reflection like a secret it wasn't ready to tell. 3 years. Had it really been 3 years since I'd held her hand in the hospital while machines beeped their mechanical lullabies? The cancer had been swift, which the doctors said was a mercy. Swift for her, maybe. For me, it had been like watching someone tear pages out of a book I wasn't finished reading. I pulled the quilt closer and breathed in the faint scent that still clung to the fabric. Lavender from the sachets she'd sewn into the batting, mixed with the particular sweetness of the hand cream she'd used every night before bed. These were the details that mattered, the small intimacies that made a life real. Not the grand gestures or the milestone moments, but the quiet rituals that nobody else would remember. Ethan had been different then, in those last weeks. He'd visited more often, brought flowers, sat beside her bed while she dozed. I'd thought grief would bring us closer, the way shared loss sometimes does. Instead, it had opened a canyon between us that grew wider with each passing month. Maybe it was because he'd inherited Caroline's hope and my stubbornness, but none of her patience. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe watching your mother die forces you to confront your own mortality, and some people respond by grabbing for everything they can reach. The photo album lay open on my lap, to a page Caroline had titled Christmas 1987 in her careful script. Ethan was 12, gap-toothed, and grinning under the tree we'd cut ourselves from the woods behind the house. He was holding up a model airplane kit, the complex kind that required patience and precision to assemble correctly. I remembered how we'd worked on it together at this same kitchen table, his small fingers carefully gluing each piece while I read the instructions aloud. "Why do we have to wait for the glue to dry?" he'd asked, eager to move to the next step. "Because if you rush," I'd told him, "it'll fall apart when you need it most." He'd learned that lesson then, at 12. Somewhere between then and now, he'd forgotten it. Or maybe he decided that patience was a luxury he couldn't afford, that taking what you wanted was faster than earning it. I turned the page. Christmas, 1992. Ethan at 17, trying to look too cool for family photos, but unable to hide his smile as Caroline draped tinsel around his neck like a graduation stole. He'd been accepted to college by then, full of plans and dreams that seemed to change every week. Engineer, architect, maybe law school. The world was wide open, full of possibilities that didn't require taking anything away from anyone else. When had that changed? I flipped through more pages, looking for clues. College graduation, he looked proud but restless. His first apartment, excited but impatient. The early years with Madison, happy, but there was something in her posture even then. The way she stood slightly apart from our family, as if she was observing rather than joining. The wedding photos told a clearer story. Madison radiant in white silk that probably cost more than my truck, her parents beaming with the satisfaction of people whose daughter had married well, if not quite as well as they'd hoped. And Ethan, handsome in his rented tuxedo, looking like a man who'd won something important, but wasn't quite sure what the prize was. Caroline had worried about the wedding expenses. $20,000 for one day, she'd whispered to me, while we watched the preparations unfold. "Richard, that's more than we spent on our entire first year of marriage." But I'd wanted to give Ethan something special, wanted to start his marriage with generosity rather than lectures about fiscal responsibility. So I'd written the check and tried not to think about the retirement funds it came from, the vacation Caroline and I had postponed, the roof repairs I'd had to do myself instead of hiring professionals. That might have been where it started, not the greed, but the expectation. The idea that I would always provide, always sacrifice, always put his needs ahead of my own comfort. Caroline had seen it too, though she'd tried to hide her concern behind supportive smiles and encouraging words. "He'll learn," she'd said after Ethan's third request for financial help in as many months. Young couples always struggle at first. But the requests hadn't stopped. The amounts had gotten larger, the explanations vaguer. A business opportunity that required immediate investment. A security deposit on a better apartment. Car repairs that somehow cost twice what my mechanic would have charged. Each time, Caroline and I had debated quietly in our bedroom, weighing our concerns against our love for our son. "He's taking advantage," I'd said finally, after a particularly expensive emergency that turned out to be a vacation to Mexico. "He's finding his way," Caroline had replied. "We can afford to help." Could we? I wasn't so sure anymore. The construction business had been good to us, but I wasn't getting any younger, and the physical demands of the work were taking their toll. We'd talked about retirement, about traveling to the places we'd always promised ourselves we'd see someday. Scotland, where Caroline's grandmother had been born, the Grand Canyon, which she'd dreamed of visiting since she was a girl. Those dreams had died with her, buried under medical bills and funeral expenses, and the simple reality that some journeys were only meaningful when shared. But the money we'd saved for them, that was still sitting in accounts that Ethan apparently thought should be his inheritance, available for immediate withdrawal. The clock in the hallway chimed 3 times. I closed the photo album and set it aside, my chest tight with the familiar ache of missing someone whose absence never stopped feeling fresh. 3 years wasn't long enough to forget the sound of her voice or the way she hummed while cooking dinner. It wasn't long enough to stop expecting her to walk through the door, apologizing for being late while she unwound her scarf and told me about her day. But it was apparently long enough for my son to decide I'd grieved too much, held on too tightly, refused to move on in the way that would be most convenient for him and his new family. I walked to the kitchen and made fresh coffee, though dawn was still hours away. The routine was soothing, measuring the grounds, listening to the machine gurgle to life, watching the dark liquid drip into the pot. Simple tasks that required no decisions, no negotiations, no weighing of competing needs and hidden agendas. Through the kitchen window, I could see the dock where Caroline and I had shared thousands of conversations over the years. Morning coffee before work, evening wine after dinner, late-night talks when sleep wouldn't come, and we needed to work through some problem or plan some project. She'd been my best friend, my closest advisor, the person who could talk me out of bad ideas and into good ones with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a gentle question. What would she have said about today's confrontation? I could almost hear her voice, measured and thoughtful. "Richard, what do you really want here? To punish them or to protect yourself?" Both, I realized. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't some doddering old fool to be managed and manipulated. I wanted them to face consequences for treating my grief like an inconvenience and my home like an asset to be liquidated. But more than anything, I wanted to keep the life Caroline and I had built together, to honor her memory by refusing to let it be erased for someone else's comfort. The phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. 4 a.m. Nothing good ever came from calls at that hour. I checked the caller ID, Ethan again. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started again. Persistent, demanding, the electronic equivalent of pounding on my door until I answered. On the 4th ring, I picked up. "Do you know what time it is?" I said instead of hello. "Dad, I've been thinking." His voice was thick with exhaustion or alcohol, maybe both. "About what you said earlier, about us not calling, not visiting." I waited, coffee cup warm in my free hand. "You're right," he continued. "We should have done better, should have been there more. But it goes both ways, you know. You could have called us too. You could have made an effort. I did make an effort, every birthday, every holiday, every time you needed money. That's not the same thing, isn't it? When was the last time you called just to talk? When was the last time you asked about something other than what you could get from me?" Silence stretched across the line. In the background, I could hear the murmur of voices. Madison and her parents, no doubt, coaching him through this conversation the way they'd coached Madison earlier. "Dad, we want to fix this," he said finally. "But you have to meet us halfway. You have to be reasonable about the house." There it was, the real reason for the 4 a.m. call. Not remorse, not genuine desire to repair our relationship, but another angle of attack on the same target. "I am being reasonable," I said. "I'm keeping what's mine. It's just a building, Dad. Mom's not in the walls and floorboards. She's in your memories, in your heart. You can carry those anywhere." The casual dismissal of everything Caroline and I had created together hit like a physical blow. Just a building. As if the 43 years we'd spent making it a home meant nothing. As if the love and labor and dreams we'd poured into every room were just sentimental nonsense to be discarded when convenient. "Ethan," I said quietly, "your mother picked out every piece of hardware in this house. Every doorknob, every light fixture, every tile in the bathroom. She planted every flower in that garden, chose every color on every wall. When I sit in her chair and look out at the lake, I can hear her voice telling me which birds are at the feeder, which plants need watering, which neighbors walk their dogs past while I was at work." My voice was steady, but my hands were trembling. "This isn't just a building. It's the only place left where she's still alive. And you want me to give it up so your in-laws can have a nice retirement. Dad, no, you've said enough for one night. We'll talk when you're sober and they're not whispering in your ear." I hung up and turned off the phone. The coffee was getting cold, but I drank it anyway, standing at the window and watching the eastern sky slowly lighten from black to deep blue to gray. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice wild and lonely and utterly free. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, I'd made my decision. They wanted to play games with lawyers and medical evaluations and threats about my capacity. Fine. I'd spent 40 years learning to read blueprints, building codes, and contract law. Time to put that education to use. I pulled out the phone book, yes, I still had one, and found the number I was looking for. Marcus Henley, attorney at law. We'd done business before, back when I was expanding the construction company. He was old school, careful, and absolutely ruthless when someone tried to take advantage of his clients. It was still too early to call, but I wrote his number on the legal pad next to my growing list of options. By the time his office opened at 9, I'd have a plan. Ethan was right about one thing. Caroline wasn't in the walls and floorboards. She was in my memories, in my heart, in the way I still set 2 coffee cups on the counter before remembering I was alone. But she was also in the choice to fight for what mattered, to stand my ground when standing was hard, to build something that would last. And this house, this life, this final testament to our 43 years together, that was going to last, whether my son understood it or not. Marcus Henley's office occupied the top floor of a brick building that had been old when I was young. The elevator wheezed and groaned its way up 3 flights, giving me time to rehearse what I was going to say. But when the doors opened and I saw Marcus behind his mahogany desk, silver-haired and sharp-eyed as ever, the words came easier than I'd expected. "Richard." He stood to shake my hand, his grip still firm despite his 75 years. "Been too long. How are you holding up?" "Better than some people think," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Worse than others hope." He laughed, the dry chuckle of a man who'd spent 50 years listening to people's problems and finding legal solutions to emotional messes. "What can I do for you?" I told him everything. The morning visit, the phone calls, the barely veiled threats about my mental capacity. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "They want the property," he said. "It wasn't a question. Lock, stock, and barrel. They've got it all figured out. Where I'll live, how I'll be taken care of, what's best for everyone involved. Everyone except me. And you don't want to sell. I don't want to be managed like an asset in someone else's portfolio." Marcus nodded slowly. "Richard, I have to ask, are you having any issues with memory, cognitive function, anything they could use to support a competency challenge?" The question stung, but I understood why he had to ask it. I can still frame a house, balance a checkbook, and remember where I put my keys. My doctor says I'm sharper than most men my age. Good. We'll get that documented. What about your financial situation? I pulled out the folder I'd prepared that morning: bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, the deed to the lake house. Marcus reviewed each document carefully, his practiced eye catching details I might have missed. "You're in solid shape," he said finally. "House is paid off, no outstanding debts, enough liquid assets to maintain your lifestyle indefinitely. No financial reason why you'd need a guardian or conservator. But they could still try? They could try. Adult children sometimes file for guardianship when they think their parents are making poor decisions. But the bar is high. They'd have to prove you're mentally incapacitated or unable to care for yourself. Based on what you've told me and what I see here, that would be a tough sell." Relief flooded through me like cool water. "So I'm safe? From a legal challenge? Probably. But, Richard, there are other ways to apply pressure. They could make your life difficult in ways that don't involve courtrooms." I thought about the phone calls, the coordinated visit, the way they'd presented their demands as fait accompli. They're already doing that. Then we need to get ahead of it. Marcus pulled out a fresh legal pad and started writing. "First, we update your estate documents: will, power of attorney, healthcare directives. Make sure everything is current and reflects your wishes. Second, we document their attempts at coercion: every phone call, every conversation, every threat, implicit or explicit. And third," Marcus smiled, and for a moment he looked like the young lawyer who'd helped me navigate my first commercial contracts 40 years ago. "Third, we make it very clear that you're not some confused old man who can be bullied into signing papers. We show them exactly who they're dealing with." I left his office 2 hours later with a briefcase full of documents and a plan that felt solid as a foundation. Marcus would handle the legal paperwork, but the rest was up to me: documentation, witnesses, evidence of their attempts to manipulate me, all the things that would matter if this escalated beyond family squabbles into something more serious. The drive home took me past the construction site where I had built my first commercial project, a small office building that still stood solid and square 35 years later. The current tenants had painted it beige instead of the red brick I'd chosen, but the bones were mine: the careful measurements, the proper footings, the attention to detail that meant it would outlast the people who'd commissioned it. That's what they didn't understand about building. It wasn't just about putting materials together in the right order. It was about creating something that would endure, that would serve its purpose long after the builder was gone. You didn't tear down a good building just because someone else wanted to use the lot. At home, I made coffee and sat down with the legal pad Marcus had given me, already half filled with his neat handwriting. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote "documentation log," and underneath it, the date and time of this morning's visit. Then I began reconstructing every conversation, every subtle threat, every moment when they'd revealed their true intentions. The phone rang while I was writing. I checked the caller ID, Madison again. I let it go to voicemail, but kept writing, noting the time and frequency of the call. When it rang again 5 minutes later, I did the same thing. "Evidence," Marcus had said. "Document everything." On the fourth call, I picked up. "Richard, please, we need to talk." Madison's voice was strained, less polished than usual. "There's been a misunderstanding." "Has there?" "Gerald spoke with our lawyer this morning. He says there might be complications with our housing situation if we can't resolve this soon." Interesting. Their lawyer, not their family counselor or their real estate agent. They were already thinking in legal terms, which meant this was more serious than they had initially let on. "What kind of complications?" I asked, pen poised over the legal pad. "Financial ones. Richard, we may lose our apartment if we can't come to an arrangement. Gerald's unemployment benefits are running out, and with Mom's medical expenses..." She was painting a picture of desperation, trying to make me feel guilty for their poor planning. But I'd learned something from 40 years of dealing with subcontractors and suppliers. When someone tells you how desperate they are, they're usually trying to justify doing something they know is wrong. "That sounds like a personal problem," I said. "It's a family problem. You could solve it tomorrow if you wanted to." "By giving up my home. By sharing it. Richard, we're not asking you to move out entirely, just to make room for people who need it." "In exchange for what?" Silence. Then, "I don't understand." You want me to give up my house, my privacy, my independence. What do I get in return? You get family, you get people who care about you, who can help when you need it. I've managed fine on my own for 3 years. Have you? Really? Her voice sharpened. When was the last time you had a real conversation with another human being? When did you last leave that house for anything other than groceries or doctor visits? Richard, you're disappearing into that place, and we're worried about you. It was a clever pivot from demanding my house to expressing concern for my welfare, but I'd heard the same tactic from contractors who wanted to upsell me on unnecessary work. Create a problem, then offer to solve it for a price. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm not disappearing. I'm living. Alone. By choice. For how long? What happens when you can't drive anymore? When you can't maintain that big house? When something happens and there's no one there to help? The questions hit close to home because I'd asked them myself during the long, sleepless hours after Caroline's funeral. But I'd found answers that didn't involve surrendering my autonomy to people who saw me as a burden to be managed. Madison, I said, let me ask you something. If I agreed to your arrangement, who would make the decisions about the house? About maintenance, about renovations, about who comes and goes? We'd discuss everything as a family. But who would have the final say? Another pause. In the background, I could hear Gerald's voice, sharp and impatient. When Madison came back on the line, her tone had changed again. Richard, I think you're overcomplicating this. We're offering you a chance to stay in your home while getting the help and companionship you need. Most people your age would be grateful for that kind of support. Most people my age haven't spent 40 years learning to recognize a con job when they hear one. The words hung between us like a challenge. I could hear her breathing change, the careful composure starting to crack. That's a terrible thing to say. Is it? Then explain to me how this benefits anyone except Gerald and Patricia. They're good people, Richard. They raised a wonderful daughter. They've worked hard their whole lives, and now they need a place to live with dignity. You have that place. You could share it. Or I could keep it. You could, but ask yourself, is that what Caroline would have wanted? Would she want you isolated and alone, or surrounded by family? It was a low blow, using Caroline's memory against me. But it also revealed something important. They thought my grief made me weak, malleable, susceptible to emotional manipulation. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Caroline, I said slowly, would have wanted me to be happy. And I'm happy here, in the home we built together, surrounded by the things we chose together, living the life we planned together. What she wouldn't have wanted is for me to be bullied out of that happiness by people who mistake kindness for weakness. Nobody's bullying you, aren't you? You show up uninvited, make demands disguised as requests, threaten legal action when I don't comply, and now you're trying to use my dead wife's memory to guilt me into submission. What would you call that? The line went quiet. When Madison spoke again, her voice was cold. I'd call it family looking out for each other, but if you want to see it as something else, that's your choice. Just remember, we're trying to do this the easy way. The threat was clear, easy way or hard way, but either way, they intended to get what they wanted. Madison, I said, I've been building things for 40 years. You know what I learned? The easy way usually means cutting corners, and when you cut corners, things fall down. I hung up and immediately called Marcus. They're escalating, I told him. Financial pressure, emotional manipulation, and veiled threats about doing this the hard way, if I don't cooperate. Good, he said, which surprised me. Good? The more pressure they apply, the more evidence we have of coercion. Keep documenting everything. And Richard, don't let them rattle you. You're in a stronger position than they want you to believe. After we hung up, I sat at Caroline's desk and continued writing, documenting every word of the conversation while it was still fresh. The legal pad was filling up quickly. Dates, times, quotes, witnesses. The foundation of a case I hoped I'd never have to make. But if Ethan and his new family wanted to play hardball, I was ready for them. They thought they were dealing with a grief-stricken old man who could be pushed around and manipulated. They were about to discover they'd picked a fight with someone who knew how to build things that last, and how to tear down things that didn't deserve to stand. The envelope arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered by a courier who looked uncomfortable, handing over what was obviously legal documents. Inside was a formal letter from Patterson, Wade and Associates, Gerald's lawyers apparently, requesting a meeting to discuss the welfare and living arrangements of Mr. Richard Dalton. The language was polite but unmistakable. They were questioning my competency. I set the letter on Caroline's desk next to my growing file of documentation and called Marcus immediately. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said after I read him the letter. "Usually these things drag out for months. They must be under more financial pressure than they're letting on." "What do I do?" "We respond in kind. I'll draft a letter making it clear that you have competent legal representation and that any future communications should go through this office. But, Richard, we also need to be proactive. They're trying to control the narrative, so we need to establish our own." Meaning? Meaning we get you evaluated by professionals of our choosing before they can shop around for doctors who'll say what they want to hear. A full medical workup, cognitive assessment, psychological evaluation, the works. When this ends up in front of a judge, we want bulletproof documentation that you're exactly what you appear to be. A competent adult making reasoned decisions about your own life. I spent the next week driving to appointments. Dr. Sarah Chen, my longtime physician, put me through a comprehensive physical that would have been exhausting 20 years ago. Blood work, EKG, stress tests, cognitive screenings that felt more like final exams than medical procedures. "For a 70-year-old man, you're in remarkable health," she told me as we reviewed the results. "Blood pressure's good, cholesterol's well controlled, no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. Whoever's questioning your mental capacity is going to have a hard time making that case stick." The psychological evaluation was more intensive. Dr. Margaret Hoffman spent 3 hours putting me through tests that measured everything from memory retention to problem-solving ability to emotional stability. She was thorough, professional, and completely unimpressed by my family's concerns. "Mr. Dalton," she said at the end of our session, "you're dealing with a family crisis that would stress anyone, but your responses are rational, your thought processes are clear, and your decision-making appears to be based on reasonable evaluation of your circumstances. If someone is suggesting you're not competent to manage your own affairs, they're either misinformed or acting on ulterior motives." Armed with clean bills of health from both doctors, Marcus and I prepared for whatever came next. We didn't have to wait long. The second meeting request came a week later, this time from Ethan directly. Not a legal letter, but a handwritten note that felt more like an ultimatum. "Dad, we need to settle this. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. at the house. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I called Marcus, but he was in court. His secretary said he could be there by 4 at the earliest. I considered postponing, but something in Ethan's note suggested delay wouldn't be welcome. Besides, I had 40 years of experience handling difficult negotiations. I could manage 2 hours on my own. They arrived in the same black SUV, but the dynamics were different this time. Gerald and Patricia got out first, moving with the purpose of people who'd made firm decisions. Madison followed, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive and official. Ethan came last, his face grim, avoiding eye contact as they approached the house. I let them in without pleasantries. We gathered in the living room again, but this time Gerald took charge of the conversation. "Richard, we appreciate you agreeing to meet with us," he began, settling into Caroline's chair without invitation. "We think it's time to put our cards on the table." He opened Madison's briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "We've had our attorney review the situation, and frankly, we're concerned. You're living alone in a house that's too large for one person. You've isolated yourself from friends and family, and according to neighbors we've spoken with, you've been showing signs of eccentricity." "What neighbors?" "That's not important. What matters is that people who care about you are worried." He pulled out several sheets of paper. "We have statements from Mrs. Henderson next door, saying you've been talking to yourself in the garden, from Tom Murphy across the lake, saying you've been seen walking the property at odd hours, sometimes in your nightclothes." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was furious. They'd been canvassing my neighbors, gathering ammunition for their competency challenge. Mrs. Henderson was 85 and half blind. What she thought she'd seen from her kitchen window wasn't exactly reliable testimony, and Tom Murphy was a gossip who embellished stories to make them more interesting. "Furthermore," Gerald continued, We have documentation of concerning financial behavior, large cash withdrawals, suspicious banking patterns, payments to unknown service providers. That was rich. The cash withdrawals were for household expenses, and the payments to unknown service providers were to Marcus and the doctors they had forced me to see. But Gerald presented the information as if it proved mental decline rather than reasonable preparation for their assault. Patricia leaned forward, her voice taking on the syrupy tone people use with children and invalids. "Richard, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help. You've been through so much since Caroline passed, and it's natural that grief would affect your judgment." "My judgment is fine." "Is it?" Ethan spoke for the first time, his voice tight. "Dad, when was the last time you left this house for anything other than necessary errands? When did you last have a real conversation with another person? You're disappearing into this place, and we can't just watch it happen." I looked at my son, really looked at him. 3 years ago, he'd stood beside Caroline's grave and promised to look after me. But looking after someone wasn't the same as looking out for them. And somewhere along the way, he'd confused the two. "I'm not disappearing," I said. "I'm living quietly. There's a difference." "Living quietly in a house you can barely maintain," Madison interjected. "Richard, be honest. When was the last time you had the gutters cleaned, the furnace serviced, the chimney inspected? This place is becoming unsafe." It was a clever attack because it contained just enough truth to be credible. I had been putting off some maintenance, not from incapacity, but from simple lack of urgency. A widower living alone doesn't need the same level of upkeep as a family home. But they were twisting normal prioritization into evidence of decline. Gerald pulled out another document. "Which brings us to our proposal. We're prepared to make this easy for everyone involved." He slid the paper across the coffee table. It was a contract, thick, formal, heavy with legal language. But I'd read enough contracts over the years to understand the basics. They wanted me to sign over the property to a family trust, with Gerald and Patricia as trustees. I would retain lifetime residency rights in exchange for covering property taxes and basic maintenance. "This way," Gerald explained, "you get to stay in your home while ensuring it's properly managed for the future, and Patricia and I get a stable place to live out our retirement. Everyone wins." I read through the contract carefully, noting the clauses that seemed reasonable on the surface but contained hidden traps. The lifetime residency was contingent on my continued capacity for independent living, with that capacity to be determined by annual evaluations conducted by medical professionals chosen by the trustees. The basic maintenance I'd be responsible for included major repairs and improvements. Essentially, I'd be paying for the upkeep of a house I no longer owned. Most telling of all was a clause buried in the middle of the document that gave the trustees authority to make necessary decisions regarding the welfare and housing arrangements of the beneficiary if circumstances required it. In plain English, they could kick me out of my own home if they decided it was in my best interest. "This is very generous," I said finally, setting the contract aside, "but I'm not interested." Gerald's mask of patience slipped slightly. "Richard, let's be realistic. You're 70 years old, you're living alone, and you're showing signs of decline that concern everyone who knows you. This contract protects your interests while ensuring you get the care and support you need. What I need is to be left alone in my own home. That's no longer an option." Patricia's voice was sharp now, the syrupy sweetness replaced by something harder. "Richard, we've tried to be nice about this, but you're not leaving us much choice. Gerald has filed a preliminary petition with the county requesting a competency evaluation. If you won't accept our help voluntarily, the court will have to decide what's best for you." The threat hung in the air like smoke. They'd shown their hand completely now. This wasn't a family meeting. It was an intervention designed to give me one last chance to surrender before they escalated to legal force. I thought about Caroline, about the 43 years we'd spent building this life together, about the dreams we'd deferred to help Ethan through college, the vacations we'd postponed to pay for his wedding, the sacrifices we'd made because that's what parents do for their children. And now those children, or the people they'd become, wanted to take the last thing I had left of our life together. "Ethan," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 12 and wanted to quit Little League because the other kids were better than you?" He looked surprised by the change of subject. "Dad, what does that have to do with... Do you remember what I told you?" His jaw tightened. You said quitting was easy, but it was permanent. That once you gave up on something, it was hard to ever believe in yourself again. That's right. I told you that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was hard. I stood and walked to the mantel, where Caroline's photo smiled down at us. This house, this life, the memory of your mother. These are things worth fighting for. I turned back to face them. So, here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your contract and your threats and your lawyers and get out of my house. And if you want to challenge my competency in court, you're welcome to try. But you should know that I've been evaluated by doctors of my own choosing, and they found me to be exactly what I am, a competent adult making reasonable decisions about his own life. The room went silent. Gerald's face was flushed, Patricia looked stunned, and Madison was staring at me as if I'd just grown a second head. But it was Ethan's reaction that mattered most. My son was looking at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years. Not respect exactly, but recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in a long time. "Dad," he said finally, "you're making a mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." They left without another word, filing out to their SUV with the stiff dignity of people who'd been denied something they'd considered already theirs. I watched from the window as they drove away, gravel spitting from their tires like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. When the sound of their engine faded, I called Marcus. "How did it go?" he asked. "They showed their hand completely," I said. "Threatened competency proceedings, presented a contract that would have made me a tenant in my own home, tried to use Caroline's memory against me. And I sent them packing." Marcus chuckled. "Good. They're moving too fast, getting desperate. That works in our favor. What's our next move?" "We wait. Let them make their legal filing, then we respond with everything we've got. Medical evaluations, financial records, documentation of their coercion attempts. By the time we're done, the only question will be whether they're acting from misguided concern or naked greed." I hung up and sat in Caroline's chair, looking out at the lake she'd loved so much. The afternoon light was golden on the water, the way it got in autumn when the air was clear and the trees were starting to turn. A pair of loons floated near the dock, diving for fish with the kind of patient precision that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. The court papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the same uncomfortable courier who'd brought Gerald's first letter. But this time, the envelope was thicker, more official, stamped with the seal of the county probate court. Inside was a formal petition requesting a competency hearing for one Richard James Dalton, filed by his son, Ethan Michael Dalton, out of concern for his father's welfare and ability to manage his own affairs. I read through it twice, my anger building with each paragraph. They'd painted me as a confused, isolated old man living in unsafe conditions, making poor financial decisions, and showing signs of mental deterioration. The evidence they cited was thin. The neighbor gossip Gerald had mentioned, my withdrawal from social activities, and what they termed obsessive attachment to property associated with deceased spouse. That last phrase hit hardest. They'd turned my love for Caroline, my refusal to abandon the home we'd built together, into a symptom of mental illness. Obsessive attachment. As if 43 years of marriage were something pathological that needed to be cured. I called Marcus immediately. "I've been expecting this," he said after I read him the petition. "They're required to give us 30 days' notice before the hearing, which gives us time to prepare our response. How are you holding up?" "Angry, but focused." "Good. Anger can be useful if you channel it properly. Let's meet this afternoon and go over our strategy." Marcus's office felt different that afternoon, less like a consultation and more like a war room. Legal texts were spread across his desk, yellow highlighter marking relevant passages. A tape recorder sat ready to document our conversation. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a legal battle with everything I valued at stake. "Here's what we're dealing with," Marcus began, consulting his notes. "Under state law, they have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that you're incapacitated and unable to manage your personal affairs. The bar is high, but not impossible to clear if the judge is sympathetic to their narrative." "What narrative?" "Grieving widower, isolated and declining, making poor decisions due to mental deterioration. They'll probably bring in a psychiatrist who will testify that your attachment to the house is unhealthy, that you're living in the past instead of accepting reality. I thought about the contract they'd tried to force on me, the way Gerald had spoken about my eccentricity, as if grief were a disease that needed treatment. What's our counter-narrative? Competent adult exercising his legal right to live as he chooses. Man who's built a successful business, maintained his health, and made rational decisions about his future in the face of family pressure motivated by financial gain. Marcus pulled out a thick folder. Here's what we have working for us. Clean bill of health from Dr. Chen, cognitive evaluation from Dr. Hoffman showing no signs of impairment, financial records demonstrating sound money management, and, most importantly, documentation of their attempts to coerce you into signing over your property. He opened the folder to reveal photocopies of every note I'd made, every conversation I'd recorded, every threat they'd made. The evidence was damning, but would it be enough? The key, Marcus continued, is showing that this petition isn't about your welfare. It's about their financial needs. They want the property, and they're using the legal system to take what they couldn't get through persuasion. We spent the next 2 hours preparing my testimony, anticipating their arguments, and identifying witnesses who could speak to my competency. Dr. Chen and Dr. Hoffman, obviously. Mrs. Patterson from the bank, who could testify about my financial management. Tom Henderson from the hardware store, who'd known me for 20 years and could speak to my continued engagement with the community. What about character witnesses? Marcus asked. People who can testify about your relationship with Caroline, your commitment to maintaining her memory in appropriate ways. I thought about the friends who'd drifted away after the funeral, the neighbors who offered sympathy but preferred to keep their distance from grief. Death made people uncomfortable, reminded them of their own mortality. Most of my old friendships had faded, not from lack of care, but from simple awkwardness. There's Father McKenna, I said finally. From St. Mary's. He did Caroline's funeral, and I still see him occasionally at the cemetery. Marcus made a note. Good. Clergy make excellent character witnesses. Anyone else? I was about to say no when I remembered something. There's a young woman named Sarah who works at the library. Caroline and I used to volunteer there together, helping with the literacy program. Sarah still asks about me when I come in, remembers Caroline fondly. She might be willing to testify about my mental state, my ability to engage normally with people. Perfect. We'll want to show that while you value privacy, you're not withdrawn or antisocial. You function normally in appropriate social settings. As we wrapped up the meeting, Marcus grew serious. Richard, I need you to understand what we're up against. Even if we win this hearing, even if the judge finds you completely competent, this is going to damage your relationship with Ethan permanently. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the boy who'd learned to fish from my dock, who'd helped me build Caroline's garden shed, who'd cried in my arms when his goldfish died. Then I thought about the man who'd stood in my living room and threatened legal action because I wouldn't give him my house. The relationship was already damaged, I said, maybe beyond repair. All I can do now is protect what's left of the life Caroline and I built together. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation, medical appointments to update my records, meetings with potential witnesses, strategy sessions with Marcus. I found myself documenting everything obsessively, not just conversations with Ethan and his family, but daily activities that demonstrated my competency. Grocery shopping, bill paying, home maintenance, social interactions. The documentation felt strange at first, like being a spy in my own life. But it also gave me focus, a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. I was building a case, constructing evidence the way I'd once constructed houses, carefully, methodically, with attention to every detail that might matter later. 2 weeks before the hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in the garden, pruning Caroline's roses the way she'd taught me, when a car pulled into the driveway. Not the black SUV I'd grown to dread, but a small blue sedan I didn't recognize. The woman who got out was about 40, professionally dressed but not intimidating. She approached with the cautious friendliness of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. Mr. Dalton, I'm Jennifer Walsh with the County Social Services Department. I'm here to conduct a home assessment as part of the competency evaluation process. I set down my pruning shears and studied her face. She seemed genuinely concerned rather than hostile, more like Dr. Hoffman than Gerald's lawyers. I wasn't expecting anyone today. I'm sorry about that. We try to do these assessments without advance notice. It gives us a more accurate picture of daily living conditions. Fair enough. I gestured toward the house. Come on in. For the next hour, Jennifer Walsh walked through my home with the eye of someone trained to spot problems. She checked the cleanliness of the kitchen, the organization of the medicine cabinet, the safety of the stairs and walkways. She asked about my daily routine, my social contacts, my ability to manage household tasks. Mr. Dalton, she said as we finished the tour, I have to say, everything here looks perfectly normal. The house is clean and well-maintained, you appear to be in good health, and you've answered all my questions clearly and appropriately. But, she smiled slightly. No buts. I'll be filing a report stating that I found no evidence of self-neglect or inability to maintain safe living conditions. Whatever concerns your family has raised, they're not supported by what I've observed here. After she left, I called Marcus with the good news. Excellent, he said. That's another piece of evidence in our favor. How are you feeling about the hearing? Ready, I said, and realized I meant it. More than ready. The night before the hearing, I sat in Caroline's chair and looked through the photo albums one more time. Not from nostalgia, but from determination. These pictures, these memories, this life we'd built together. It was all worth fighting for. Not because I was living in the past, but because the past had made me who I was, and who I was deserved respect. I thought about what Caroline would say if she were here. She'd probably tell me to be strong, but not stubborn, to fight for what mattered, but not lose myself in the process. She'd remind me that Ethan was still my son, whatever else had happened between us. But she'd also tell me to stand my ground. Caroline had never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered, whether it was battling the insurance company over a claim, or standing up to the school board when they wanted to cut the arts program. She understood that some things were worth defending, even when the cost was high, especially then. I closed the photo album and went to bed, setting my alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow would determine whether the life Caroline and I had built together would survive, or whether it would be parceled out to people who saw it only as an asset to be liquidated. But I'd done everything I could to prepare. The rest was up to the judge, the law, and whatever justice might still exist in a system that was supposed to protect people like me from people like them. One way or another, tomorrow it would be over. And whatever happened, I'd face it the way Caroline had taught me to face everything difficult in life, with dignity, determination, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when the right thing is hard. The alarm was set, the documents were ready. The fight would begin at 9 a.m. sharp. I was ready for it. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the grand halls of justice you see in movies. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white that made everyone look tired. I sat at the respondents' table next to Marcus, wearing my best suit, the navy one Caroline had helped me pick out for Ethan's wedding. It felt appropriate somehow, wearing something she'd chosen for what might be the last battle I'd ever fight. Across the aisle, Ethan sat with Madison and Gerald, flanked by their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Wells, who looked like she could cut glass with her stare. They didn't look at me as we waited for the judge to appear, but I could feel the tension radiating from their table like heat from a furnace. Judge Margaret Thornton entered at exactly 9 o'clock, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from years of listening to people's problems and making decisions about their lives. She settled behind the bench, reviewed the files spread before her, and looked up with eyes that missed nothing. This is a petition for guardianship filed by Ethan Dalton regarding his father, Richard Dalton, she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority. Mr. Wells, you may present your case. Patricia Wells stood, her opening statement crisp and devastating. She painted me as a man clinging to the past, isolated and declining, making poor decisions about my health and safety. She cited the neighbor reports, my withdrawal from social activities, and what she called my obsessive refusal to accept appropriate living arrangements. Your Honor, she concluded, the petitioner's concern is not about property or inheritance. It's about ensuring that an elderly man receives the care and supervision he needs to live safely and with dignity. Marcus's opening was quieter, but more powerful. He outlined my actual condition: physically healthy, mentally sharp, financially stable, and contrasted it with the picture the petitioners were trying to paint. Then he dropped the bombshell. Your Honor, we will show that this petition is not motivated by genuine concern for Mr. Dalton's welfare, but by the petitioner's desire to gain control of his property. We have documentation of repeated attempts to coerce Mr. Dalton into signing over his home, including explicit threats of legal action when he refused to comply. I watched Ethan's face tighten as Marcus spoke. This wasn't the narrative he had expected to hear. The petitioners called their witnesses first. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, testified in a wavering voice about seeing me talking to myself in the garden, conversations I'd been having with Caroline's memory while tending her roses. Tom Murphy, the gossip from across the lake, embellished his observations about my odd behavior into a story that bore little resemblance to reality. Then came Dr. Richard Steinberg, the psychiatrist they had hired to evaluate me based solely on their descriptions. He'd never met me, never examined me, but he testified confidently about pathological grief and delusional attachment to deceased spouse. According to him, my refusal to leave the house Caroline and I had shared was evidence of mental illness requiring intervention. Marcus tore him apart on cross-examination. Doctor, you've never actually examined Mr. Dalton, have you? No, but based on the family's descriptions. So your entire testimony is based on second-hand reports from people who have a financial interest in the outcome of this hearing? I wouldn't characterize it that way. How would you characterize it? You're testifying about the mental state of a man you've never met, based on information provided by people who want to take control of his property. Dr. Steinberg's confidence began to crack. The family's concerns appear genuine. Do they? Let me ask you this. If a widower chooses to remain in the home he shared with his deceased wife, is that automatically pathological? Not automatically, and if that same widower maintains his health, manages his finances responsibly, and continues to function independently in his community, would those factors affect your assessment? They would be relevant, yes. But you didn't investigate any of those factors, did you? You simply accepted the family's version of events. By the time Marcus finished with him, Dr. Steinberg looked like a man who wished he'd never agreed to testify. Then it was our turn. Dr. Chen took the stand first, her testimony calm and authoritative. She detailed my excellent physical health, my clear mental acuity, my responsible approach to medical care. Mr. Dalton is one of my healthiest 70-year-old patients, she testified. He manages his medications properly, keeps his appointments, and shows no signs of cognitive decline. Dr. Hoffman followed, describing the comprehensive psychological evaluation she'd conducted. Mr. Dalton's responses were entirely normal, she testified. He's dealing with grief in a healthy way, making rational decisions about his living situation, and showing no signs of the pathological attachment the petitioners describe. But it was Jennifer Walsh's testimony that seemed to carry the most weight with Judge Thornton. The social worker described her unannounced visit, her thorough assessment of my living conditions, and her professional conclusion. Your Honor, I found no evidence of self-neglect, unsafe living conditions, or inability to manage daily activities. Mr. Dalton's home is clean and well-maintained. He appeared well-groomed and appropriately dressed, and he answered all questions clearly and coherently. In my professional opinion, he does not require supervision or intervention. Then Marcus called me to the stand. The questions started simply: my name, age, address, basic information, to establish my mental clarity. Then we moved to more complex topics: my financial management, my daily routine, my social contacts. I answered each question clearly, showing the judge that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a competent adult making informed decisions about his own life. Mr. Dalton, Marcus said, can you explain to the court why you've chosen to remain in your current home despite your family's concerns? I looked at Ethan as I answered, hoping he might understand even now. Your Honor, that house isn't just where I live. It's where my wife and I built our life together. Every room holds memories we created. Every piece of furniture was chosen by both of us. Every plant in the garden was put there by her hands. When I'm there, she's still with me in a way that wouldn't be possible anywhere else. And you understand that maintaining such a large property requires significant effort and expense? I do, and I'm capable of both. I've maintained that property for 23 years, and I can continue to do so for as long as my health allows. What about your family's concerns about isolation? I choose to live quietly, but I'm not isolated. I interact with neighbors, shop at local businesses, maintain relationships with people in the community. The difference is that I don't need constant social stimulation to be content. I find peace in solitude, especially in a place filled with happy memories. Patricia Wells's cross-examination was aggressive but unsuccessful. She tried to make me appear confused, stubborn, or unreasonable, but I'd spent 40 years dealing with hostile questioning from building inspectors and insurance investigators. Her tactics were familiar and ultimately ineffective. Mr. Dalton, don't you think your family knows what's best for you? I think my family knows what's best for them. That's not necessarily the same thing. Isn't it selfish to refuse help when people are offering it out of love? It would be selfish to accept help I don't need just to make other people feel better about themselves. The final witness was Father McKenna, who testified about my regular visits to Caroline's grave, my continued involvement in church activities, and his assessment of my mental and spiritual health. Mr. Dalton is grieving, as any man would after losing his wife of 43 years, the priest testified, but his grief is healthy and appropriate. He honors his wife's memory while continuing to live his own life with dignity and purpose. When all the testimony was finished, Judge Thornton called a recess while she reviewed the evidence. Marcus and I waited in the hallway, neither of us speaking much. There wasn't anything left to say. We'd presented our case as strongly as possible. The rest was up to the judge. An hour later, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Thornton had her decision ready. After reviewing all the evidence presented, she began, I find that the petitioners have failed to meet their burden of proof. Mr. Richard Dalton has been shown to be mentally competent, physically capable, and financially responsible. His choice to remain in his current home, while perhaps not what his family would prefer, is a rational decision made by a man fully capable of managing his own affairs. Relief flooded through me like warm water, but Judge Thornton wasn't finished. However, I want to address the underlying issues that brought us here today. Family disputes about elder care are often rooted in genuine concern, even when they're expressed inappropriately. Mr. Ethan Dalton, your father is clearly capable of making his own decisions about his living situation. But, Mr. Richard Dalton, your son's concerns about isolation and safety, while perhaps overstated, aren't entirely without merit. She looked at both of us with the stern expression of a parent settling a dispute between children. I'm dismissing this petition and directing that Mr. Richard Dalton retain full control over his personal and financial affairs. But I'm also recommending that this family find a way to communicate about these issues without involving the court system. You're both adults, you're both reasonable people, and you both claim to care about each other's welfare. Act like it. As we filed out of the courtroom, Ethan caught up with me in the hallway. For a moment, we stood there in uncomfortable silence, 40 years of shared history hanging between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Dad, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. You thought you were doing the convenient thing, I replied. There's a difference. His face crumpled slightly. I know that now. But Dad, I really was worried about you. Losing Mom, living alone in that big house. It scared me. It scared me too, I admitted. But running away from what scared me wouldn't have made it less frightening. It would have just made me a stranger to myself. We talked for a few more minutes, awkward and halting, trying to find common ground in the wreckage of our relationship. It wasn't reconciliation. Too much had been said and done for that. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that we'd both made mistakes, both caused pain we couldn't entirely undo. Can we try again? Ethan asked as we prepared to part ways. Not with the house, not with any of that, just as father and son. I looked at this man who'd once been the boy I'd taught to fish, who'd helped me build Caroline's garden shed, who'd brought her wildflowers every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy was still there, buried under years of poor decisions and misplaced priorities, but still there. We can try, I said, but slowly, and on my terms. He nodded, understanding that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt piece by piece, like a house damaged by storms. I drove home alone through familiar countryside that looked different somehow, brighter, more defined, as if the threat of losing it had made me see it more clearly. The lake came into view as I crested the last hill, blue and peaceful under the afternoon sun, unchanged by the drama that had played out in that sterile courtroom. Inside the house, I made coffee and sat in Caroline's chair, looking out at the water where a pair of loons floated near the dock. The afternoon light was golden, the way it got in autumn when the air was clear and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten page. I thought about what Judge Thornton had said about family and communication, about the fine line between genuine concern and selfish manipulation. Maybe there was wisdom in her words. Maybe there was a path forward that didn't require complete estrangement from the son I'd raised and loved, despite everything that had happened between us. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today I was exactly where I belonged, in the home Caroline and I had built together, surrounded by the memories we'd created, free to live the rest of my life on my own terms. I raised my coffee cup to her photograph on the mantel, to the garden she'd planted, to the lake that had witnessed our 43 years of marriage and would now witness whatever years remained to me. We won, I whispered to her smile. We kept what mattered most. Outside, the loons called across the water, their voices wild and free and utterly uncompromised. The sound filled the house like a blessing, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was making. Some battles were worth fighting, even when the cost was high. Some things were worth defending, even when defending them meant standing alone. This house, this life, this love that death couldn't diminish. These were worth everything I'd risked to keep them. And now they were mine to keep, for as long as I drew breath and the lake held its memories. Forever, if I was lucky. Forever, if love was stronger than law, and memory more durable than manipulation, and the homes we build in our hearts more lasting than the schemes of those who would take them away. The afternoon light faded slowly, painting the water in shades of gold and copper. I sat in Caroline's chair and watched the sun set behind the pines we'd planted together, content in the knowledge that some things endure, some promises keep themselves, and some loves are strong enough to outlast even the people who would destroy them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own possibilities for grace or conflict. But tonight, I was home, and home was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, I was replacing the boards on the dock when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel in the driveway. Not the aggressive rumble of the black SUV, but the quieter approach of a car that wasn't sure of its welcome. I looked up to see Ethan's sedan, not the luxury model he'd driven during the court proceedings, but something older, more modest. He got out alone. No Madison, no Gerald and Patricia, no briefcases full of documents. Just my son, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt I remembered from years past, carrying what looked like a toolbox. "Need help with that?" he asked, gesturing toward the half-finished dock repair. I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation that had poisoned our relationship. But I saw only the awkwardness of a man trying to bridge a gap he'd helped create. "Depends," I said. "You still remember which end of a hammer to use?" He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. "I think I can manage." We worked in comfortable silence for most of the afternoon, falling into the rhythm we'd established decades ago when he was a boy eager to help with whatever project had captured my attention. The new boards fit perfectly, cut to precise measurements and secured with the kind of care that ensures they'll last. "Dad," he said as we were cleaning up the tools, "Madison and I are getting divorced." I wasn't surprised. The stress of the court case had revealed fault lines in their marriage that probably couldn't be repaired. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" I considered the question seriously. "I'm sorry you're in pain. I'm sorry your marriage didn't work out the way you hoped. But I'm not sorry that you're finally making decisions for yourself, instead of letting other people make them for you." He nodded slowly. Her parents never forgave me for losing the case. They had to move in with Madison's sister in Cleveland, not exactly the retirement they'd planned. "Gerald and Patricia made their own choices," I said, "just like we all do." As he prepared to leave, Ethan paused at his car door. "Dad, I know I can't undo what happened, can't take back the things I said or the way I treated you, but maybe we could have Sunday dinner sometime, just the two of us, like we used to when I was a kid." I looked at this man who'd been my greatest joy and my deepest disappointment, who'd taught me that love alone wasn't enough to guarantee loyalty, but that forgiveness might be enough to allow for new beginnings. "Next Sunday," I said, 1 o'clock. "I'll make pot roast." His smile was radiant. "Mom's recipe? Is there any other?" After he drove away, I sat on the newly repaired dock and watched the sun set over Clearview Lake. Caroline's garden was in full bloom around me, tended with the same care she'd shown it, thriving under my inexperienced but devoted attention. The house behind me held 43 years of marriage, 3 years of solitude, and now the possibility of something new. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the careful construction of what might still be built. Some foundations, once cracked, never regain their original strength. But sometimes, if you're patient and careful and willing to accept that the new structure might look different from the old one, you can build something that serves its purpose and stands the test of time. Family, like carpentry, was mostly about choosing the right materials and taking the time to do the job correctly. Sunday dinner would be a good place to start. Type team. A if you side with the father. Type team B if you side with the son.